the great French poet Charles Péguy wrote that what begins as mystery ends in politics. He had his reasons, coming of age as he did in the late 19th century. He was died in World War I, a death of a soldier. And so it might be said of you in the same kind of spirit, George, that with your work, what begins in mystery ends in kind of crass consumerism and human commodification, at least in some of your work.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Well, for me, the mystery part is that in the compositional process, I'm really trying to have no agenda, have no idea of where it's going to go, what I'm going to prove, even what topics I'm going to raise. I'm really kind of proceeding on a sentence-by-sentence basis, kind of in a spirit of fun, is that the way I would think of it. So what I found is, as is indicated in the quote, if I start with that kind of non-conceptual approach, slowly the story will kind of reveal itself and things will start to accrete. And in the end, you see that the story actually does have something that it wants to say, or it has a location that it wants to be at. And then you see your own politics, your own ethics revealing themselves. It's not that you intended to say X, but X was said through you, through this process of craft, which is basically the systematic enactment of what I think we call mystery.
Mystery, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's because the artist, any person I think is taking it all in, but the artist is seeing, and so what are you seeing? Well, what you're living, right?
Yeah.
And so, the agendas. I don't know if any author worth her salt is going to have the agenda to say, I need to make this sound like this philosophy. If they do, it's this rubrical approach probably doesn't go very far.
I think it's innately condescending to say, I have this philosophy I'm going to give to you, and I'm going to make up a story to do it.
Yeah.
You can do that, but I think the reader feels the condescension and withdraws. Whereas if you say, I'm going to observe the discipline of specificity, what color is the dress, how does the light hit it, what does he say, what does she say, and the trust is that by doing that, you'll actually enact a philosophy that's more complicated and nuanced than anything you could articulate at the beginning.
Yeah, and maybe it's left for critics or just readers, people who are in dialogue, the experience of your work. I think you could call about this troika of, you have the author and you have the character and the reader, and you want to bring them up together somehow. And so when that kind of happens, and then you give it to the world, we receive. Right. And so if I follow up, then then for scholars here at Loyola and other places, we begin to say, okay, what's an apparatus of reading or some critical lenses that we look or that speak to us. And so what I would notice in your work a lot of times, in this kind of complex of anthropology and spirituality and politics and whatnot, economics, there's a target villain, it seems, in a lot of this work, or one that we just have to recognize, the elephant in the room, and that's kind of neoliberalism. And let me unpack that. Much of the short fiction that we see illuminates kind of an insidiousness of an economic structure that's assailing us. And that is, the global complex of late modern liberal media consumerism. And there's so many casualties left in its wake, it seems like. And so your characters' lives are often rendered inconsequential, or they're struggling, in this neoliberal matrix. And there's this kind of corpse cold beast, like Emerson might say, of an economy that really, in all honesty, cannot sustain itself unless it has a self-conscious ideology internalized by most of its participants. And and we seem to sustain this kind of thing like lemmings off the cliff.
Right. I agree with that, and I would say, though, in all honesty, there's one other complication, which is that I think fiction is the attempt to make a system of tension. Chekhov said, art doesn't solve problems, but it formulates them correctly. So in my experience, as a younger person, young family, I got a job at a corporation and experienced two things at once. One was exactly what you're describing. They used me up. They plundered the sensuality of my body, as Terry Eagleton would say. They filled me with catchphrases and weird passive voice constructions and so on. They also gave me insurance. And they, at a time when we had no margin for error, they got us a way for us to bring our kids to the doctor. When there was a problem, there was actually a little ad hoc community that was there to help. Yeah. So I think for me, the interesting thing about this capitalism is that it's absolutely makes sense and it absolutely doesn't make sense at once. So then, in a political sense, what it means is you could turn the dial and you could produce a lot of different kinds of capitalism. I don't think we're going to get out from under the boot of capitalism anytime soon. But you could turn the dial and find a more humane capitalism. That's immensely hopeful.
Yeah.
So I think what the story, and again, this is all my construction after the fact, but I think what the stories are doing is saying, here's a sort of a pattern of light and dark that happens in a contemporary American workplace. Can we, by looking at these exaggerated versions, sense more deeply what's actually going on, and then turn the dial to make a more humane form of it? Maybe. If there's an ethical notion behind it, that might be it.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful, and I wouldn't want to even misrepresent, because market economies have been around forever, right? And I don't know how humane they were in Roman culture or in Arabic culture in the 9th century or something. I'm sure it was maybe a lot like today, but there's something unique about this kind of plutocratic and this division, this kind of like, maybe the middle class being eradicated, and then they wake up realizing, oh, I'm feeling hit, I'm feeling like poor, and then they wake up to the plight of the poor that's been going on forever, maybe.
Because
they finally realize,
or they desperately shuttle up to identify themselves as not poor,
which we see a lot of, and I think you really locate that well in your fiction. And let me pick it up there. There are narrators in, say, Civil War Land and Bad Decline and Some Biblical Girl Diaries specifically, but this feeling I think we're talking about transcends these stories. I think of Sea Oak, and I think of someone like Aunt Bernie at her first funeral. People die twice in your stories, which is something. Times are rough.
We should all be so lucky.
To be so lucky to die. Yeah, right. That's another question. But let me just read and give you your own text, and maybe you can comment, because I think of Aunt Bernie here. So Father Brian says a prayer, and then one of us is supposed to talk. But what's there to say? She never had a life, never married, no kids, work, work, work. Did she ever go on a cruise? All her life it was buses. Buses, buses, buses. Once she went with Ma on a bus to Quigley, Kansas, to gamble and shop at an outlet mall. Someone broke into her room and stole her clothes and took a dump in her suitcase while they were at the Roy Clark show. That was it. That was the extent of her tourism. After that, it was drug town night and day. After 15 years as cashier, she got demoted to greeter. People would ask where the cold remedies were, and she'd point to some big letters on the wall that said cold remedies. There's a realism here that's heartbreaking, and of all the realisms you could talk about, I think of Aunt Bernie. Those kind of people.
Yeah. And it's, in a sense, that's both an exaggeration and an understatement of what's actually out there. Flannery O'Connor had a thing about if you're talking to someone who's hard of hearing, you have to shout. So in some of these things, the intention is to crank up the misery so that we can actually see it. But then, you go out in the world and there are stories that are far worse than that. Yeah. You add on top of that addiction, abuse, and also, Aunt Bernie was a white lady. So, so I don't think, you can, the darkness innate in capitalism almost can't be overstated, I think,
Well, to take her further, because I know when I put my critic's hat on, I think, well, where is feminism in George Saunders' work? And I think Bernie's a character to kind of indict the forgotten power, or to eclipse, or to exclude, or to diminish the power of women. And I think what you're saying, in one reading could be that this is a strong woman, and so she has her kind of Easter narrative, right, where she's comes back and she just speaks truth to power, a prophetic voice, and it reminds me of kind of when you Capable in the children's story in the Persistent Gappers of Fripp, that women are capable, Bernie's capable, and let's clear the way, remove these structures that would not let the freedom and the liberation be.
Yeah, and she's actually, Bernie is actually strong in both manifestations, but as sometimes happens in my experience in working class cultures, the strength gets embodied in a weird way. So her initial strength is the strength of denial. She can have a miserable life and say, it's fine. It's got sort of false positive thinking, which takes a lot of strength, actually, to enact that. In her case, all that strength, the way I imagine it, was all those years of denying her own misery and all those years of refusing to take her own part. At death, that power just got repurposed, almost judo, and it came into. She said, "Oh, I'm going to use all that strength to assert myself again." You know, but I also think, you know, and this is something that I realized writing about Lincoln, was that there is a way in which if you see one of our American problems is denial, which I think it is, that kind of energetic denial of misery, which takes the form sometimes of this kind of happy-faced, positive thinking. On the other side of that, people who've been leveled, like Aunt Bernie, or Lincoln, actually, at that moment, there's a kind of a dropping of the illusion of control, and suddenly the truth comes streaming in. So I think often, you know, you think of Rosa Parks, you know, people who have, you know, hit the bottom, and like, how much lower can I go? There can sometimes be an amazing reflexive truthfulness in that moment. And that's what happens to Bernie, I think.
Yeah, you know, I think most people can recognize it, or I hope they can still hear that voice of, you know, I think we can be raised on kind of pop psychology and this kind of optimism, right? And you know how to influence friends and win people, or how to win people and influence friends. And Dale Carnegie, we all know there's an example of that, even in the White House, that kind of thinking. But really, what's deeper, is speaking as kind of a Catholic, or as a, you know, just as a human being, is not optimism so much as hope. And so something bursts through and announces itself in those rock bottom moments. It's always there, but it's the real thing.
Yeah, I think for me, the order of operations is low concept, clear seeing. So if somebody, you know, if there's a big stone on your foot, you don't say, "Oh, I love it." You say, "There's a big stone on my foot." Once you say that, there's a kind of a cleansing effect. Okay, I'm not living in falsity anymore. Then the hope comes in, because there are ways to remove the stone. So I think I started out early being sort of reflexively against any kind of this positive thinking. Now I think actually there is a way of dwelling in positive phenomenon that's essential, and I think it's what you're calling hope. You know, to say we mustn't overstate the negative. And I think, you know, I read a really wonderful book called Kill All the Normies, I think is the name of it. And in there she talks about the idea that one of the things the far right is using now is the left's artistic habit of transgression, like ritual transgression. In other words, we know an artist because he's disagreeable and he hates everything, you know, or he overturns everything. She said that, in fact, that's a bit of an autopilot stance, to simply be against everything. And now the right has figured that out, that the left has a hard time critiquing transgression. So then they step over the line. But something, an idea that's really alive for me is that, you know, this sort of Dale Carnegie positive thinking is a form of autopilot. So is the kind of transgression thought. That's another kind of autopilot. And autopilot is the enemy. And to stay off autopilot is the sort of eternal challenge.
I agree. And something like hope, too, which it has an old theological virtue, but more than that. But, you know, you see, like, it doesn't have this kind of false, kitschy idea of what could happen. It's integrated, right? It understands pain and sorrow, you know, in a single sentence. You know, you hold two. This is also very Catholic, but it's more than Catholic. But this is, you know, the old line that, you know, a Catholic imagination holds two opposite things up together and proceeds as if they're not opposite, right? And there's other wisdom that has, of course, certainly an Eastern wisdom has very similar approaches to kind of what the real is. And so I think that's where we are, you know?
Well, also I think, to me, an exciting idea is that when you start talking about optimism, pessimism, hope, despair, you know, the Eastern tradition says, well, who's having the hope? And it's always the you know, the ego. Interesting to go into a realm where you could say, well, my belief in self is actually false. It's delusional. You know, this thing isn't permanent. It's not continuous. It's a really constructed thing. Then hope becomes a different thing. It becomes, in my mind anyway, tied in with receptiveness. Fully accepting what actually is, knowing that it might not be what you like. You might not like the result, but you're going to be, your stance is going to be more effective if you've properly understood what the self is. And I think the stance tends to be, this thing that I've understood is central and important and the main thing to defend actually doesn't have any substance. Therefore, my energy should go out to the other, you know, to the other.
That's beautiful. That really. I have a couple. I mean, maybe to broach them. Though there's an old Greek word for this in the kind of Christian vein, but we know that it's something bigger. That it's bigger than our language, but it's the kenosis, right? It's self-donation, other-centeredness, right? It's a very core Christian concept. It's who God is in this tradition. And so it's a wonderful when you're putting your critic hat on. Like if I can maybe jump, I think about ComCom, and I think, okay, if I'm reading as a religious critic, I could really do a Buddhist reading very easily in the same motion, a little different as a kind of Catholic reading. Especially how at the resolution of the story, it's what a beautiful work of art it is. That these selves are in one sense illusory, but they're also dissolving. They're dissolving into each other. They may be Buddhist maybe, but then it's like the body of Christ, where no one shows up alone, and there's this generosity between the characters to kind of help each other get where they're going to be going.
Right. My sense is that if you and I've learned this in a weird way through fiction.
Yeah.
That, and also my scientific background helps a little bit. So the first thing would be to say, let's examine this phenomenon called the mind. What does it do? It leads you to the conclusion that all of these phrases, Buddha nature, the body of Christ, the family of man, they're all referring to something, and I think it's a scientific reality, which is that the self is entirely constructed probably for Darwinian reasons. I believe I'm George, and if a bear comes in here, it's more important to me that he not eat me than that's normal. That's why we're made. But to go beyond that relative interpretation to the absolute interpretation, there's actually no division between you and me. There's just a bunch of atoms, and if we shake hands, the atoms mingle. The identity isn't innate in that at all. So all of these beautiful concepts that we think of as spiritual are actually quite scientific. And I think they merge. They merge in this. So in other words, when we walk out of here and I put on my coat and part from you and start thinking I'm George, that's actually incorrect. Now it's convenient and it's necessary, but it's actually a partial truth.
I mean, it's kind of funny because George has to pay his taxes.
So
there's like those kind of arrangements. But really, when we get to our deeper selves and we see one another inscribed in each other, that's scientific, it's spiritual, it's emotive.
So in Buddhism, this idea of the absolute versus the relative is really helpful to me. If a bear is about to eat me on a relative scale, that's a tragedy for me because I'm me. In an absolute sense, it's fine. In other words, the bear is doing what the bear is doing. This entity is doing what this entity is doing. So to be able to think of every phenomenon as both, there's an absolute truth and a relative truth. For me, it's really helpful. So in an absolute sense, there's no. This is one unity. This whole thing is unity. In a relative sense, no, I have to pay my taxes. But so then the idea, in my mind, especially as I get older, is to take my intuitive sense and move it towards the absolute somewhat, because the world is going to put me there whether I like it or not. On the day of my death, the absolute is going to assert itself and say, it's time for that relative entity to be no more. And the extent of your terror at that point, I think, or comfort, would have to do with how acclimated you are to the idea that this is a temporary thing that's, been put together briefly and had a lot of fun, and now it's,
I keep thinking that one Catholic response would be this kind of idea of sacramentality, which is it's the concrete universal, but those concretes, they have their relative life, cultural and personal, but then they somehow do connect analogically or in a very real way, more than just by thought but there's a larger connection to the absolute. So a lot of ways to kind of look at that.
Or also the thought that I've had the idea that the sacred or the sacramental is the ritual reminding of yourself that the habitual is not correct. So you go in once a week and you have your bell rung, by just a moment where the curtain drops and you go, oh yeah, this is, I'm going to die. There are forces that this pea brain can't grasp. Then you return to your regular life just with a little resonance of that. That's why we do it, because it's easy enough to skate along in this delusional relative state. And I think especially in a materialist culture like ours, we're encouraged to do that. The system would like us to. But to take yourself out of that habitual state through religious practice or through art is just a way of saying, most of my life I'm insane. Most of my life I'm deluded. And so is everyone else, and we go along playing. Then maybe for a few days at the end of your life, the light comes on, or when someone that you love dies, the light comes on, and it goes back off. But sacramental means this reminding ourselves that this state of mind is off.
Lovely. Okay, a little more maybe on that, but just kind of a Catholic intellectual tradition, the Hank Center, and kind of drilling down, as they say in corporate speak these days. that, the center wants to look at, interrogate, celebrate, and explore the Catholic intellectual tradition. Okay, that's its general mission. There are both obvious ways to do this and less obvious ways to do this, especially as time goes on. But we do see that the damage to the body of Christ exacted by, we talked about this late modern, kind of selfish plutocratic capitalism. We've established the tragedy of that. And so Pope Francis speaks about that and really, consistently and authentically speaks about the tragedy of disposable culture and leaving the poor behind yet again. Authentically speaks about that. This is very normal Catholicism, but there's some pushbacks, especially from Catholics, and this is very confusing to me personally and maybe to other Catholics. So I think there's been a left-leaning church for lots of years. Pope John the 23rd is very famous. Pacem et Terris, talked about his encyclical was anti-communitarian. That not that he was anti-communitarian, but that consumerism was anti-communitarian. That was the main idea of Pacem et Terris. So he critiques runaway capitalism and this kind of consumer mentality that Pope Francis seems to echo. But then we have this, among Christians, we don't have a uniform thought, Catholics or otherwise. So you have something like taking care of the poor, what Jesus talks about in the Gospels, I think more than anything else. Poor and marginalized, caring for the forgotten. And then we have a Christianity that talks about prosperity gospel, that your lot in life, that your God's favor with you is when you're wealthy. So I think I don't think you're trying to spin this in your fiction, but I find myself thinking that that's a struggle in the fiction.
Yeah. Well, it is. I was raised on the South Side here by, I think, very much in the sort of Dorothy Day, and I remember as a kid, just the version of Christ that we got, or at least that I got, was Jesus as a kind of superhero. And the superpower he had was empathy. In other words, he could look at any being and feel an unimaginable amount of love for it. And that actually was power, so much power, because you're never in doubt of what to do if you feel that. When you powerlessness is when you don't know what to do. But if you had unconditional love for all beings, as Jesus did, then there's never a doubt. And the other way of looking at it is, and this from a Buddhist perspective, everybody has Buddha nature. In other words, everybody is absolutely perfect, luminous embodiment of God. Now we crust it over with a bunch of crap, with habituation and personality and neurosis and fear. That's, and I would say for most of it, that's kind of who we are on a daily basis is, nerves and anxiety and aspiration, all that. But the idea is that luminous thing is there all the time. And the metaphor they use is the sun is always in the sky, but the clouds get in front of it. So the purpose of spiritual practice is to part the clouds. So that means that a poor person has exactly the amount of luminosity as the richest person in the world. A person who's in a decrepit spiritual condition has exactly the same amount of luminosity as someone who's a great spiritual practitioner. So then that informs our politics, it should, because what you have to do when you see any person is see 100% Buddha nature and then treat them accordingly. So to me, this answers a lot of questions that we've posed in a political way. Racism, sexism, homophobia. I find it, for me, it's helpful to sort of put those things aside and just say, no, they're spiritual questions. Is the poor person as valuable as, of course, any thoughts to the contrary it's just confusion on our part. So I think that's what the radical Christian message is, to say the part of your vision that privileges A over B, A and B being people, is always wrong.
You can see where the rational mind wants to judge something, and there's questions of justice, and ethics and morality that are part of this. But if you look at just the theology, and it's such a resonance between. But God's first name is love, and last name is love, and maybe if there's a second name, it's mercy, I would think. But we always have this mercy judgment thing that seems to, But I agree. Maybe it's how we were raised. I was raised in California, but I was always that Christ was empathy. That Christ was mercy. That was very easy for me.
Right. But one thing I've noticed, I gave the speech on kindness a few years ago, and so you become the kindness. You can never rob a bank again. But what I found is that there's a confusion about words like kindness, empathy, compassion. Kindness is, in American culture, is mistaken for niceness. You're always smiling. Everything's fine. Somebody drives a spike through your head. You say, "Oh, thank you for the coat rack." You know.
Hallmark card, yeah.
But I think Jesus, as a model of compassion, he trashed the marketplace or whatever. So it's not to be a discerning person who is working for the benefit of other people doesn't mean you be walking around in a haze of positivity. You might be harsh. You might correct emphatically. You might even be a little crazy. If the idea was, here's a person who's in error, and you had the clarity to know that. Now that's another topic, but to correct that person, you could use all kinds of means. Having been corrected, that person is now better off. That's compassion. So I think one of the things the left does now, I think, is I hear a lot this question of, in this political time, should we resist or be empathetic? But there's no contradiction in those two things.
Right. Yeah. Right. I agree, and that's this or that thinking. It's famous in humans. You're a daytime person, nighttime person. You think of all the fiction that's indicted. My God, Jekyll and Hyde. You're all the comic book. Structures, or there's these daytime Bruce Waynes and nighttime Batmans, right? These divisions. But that's fantastic, and thanks for that. On the prosperity gospel, it does trouble me, but did you know Paula White Cain is Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, and she's a prosperity gospel person. I didn't know this, but she's married to Jonathan Cain, keyboardist from Journey.
Oh,
yeah. I thought that was the funniest kind of thing.
Yeah. So prosperity, if I understand what that is correctly.
Yeah.
It's one of the interesting kind of funny things that human beings do is, if you are in condition A and you leave it, you assume that condition A doesn't exist anymore. So it turns out right now nobody gets high in the world. Who knew? So this is the same thing when someone is able to come up the ladder of success in America. There's often an amnesia about where they came from, and the assumption, the sort of sistered assumption, which is very dangerous, which is that goodwill or good fortune is the result of one's actions directly. In other words, if you succeed in life, that means you've lived virtuously, and because the related idea is that if you're in misery, it's your fault. Yeah. And that's not. Right, it's not true, but I think that's what prosperity gospel says. And it's a very dangerous. It
just overestimates the sphere of. It's kind of a narcissism. That's it's a basic narcissism. It seems to me, but.
Well, it often involves not recognizing that you were born on third base. That kind
of, think you hit a triple? Is that the one?
Yeah. But also, the idea that one's present happiness is so conditional, and this is in Buddhism they talk about samsara. It means that this cycle of desire. You desire something, you get it, and then you don't like it anymore, or you desire it, you get it, and it goes away. That's the essential human activity. So this notion that your success is related to merit, that's really short-sighted and harsh, I think.
It really is. You make me think, I couldn't agree more. It's a really great example. But I think of, St. Augustine, the famous, Lord, you made us for yourself. Our hearts are restless till they rest in you. Right? And that's, to be that spiritual Jedi master, that's your life's work. But I think we know that's not it. That's not it. That, you're restless, the restless heart. And I think a restless spirit's really good in a lot of ways. In other ways, it's a distraction.
Well, I think the problem is if you believe that someday having achieved X, you'll be happy.
Yeah.
That's So that means you can still achieve X and look a little askance at it and say, well, this thing is, I wrote a story I like. I did it. Now, tomorrow I might not be able to again. Yeah. The story may not continue to have value in the future. It's a matter of avoiding autopilot. Yeah. The autopilot that says, if I do A, my life will be successful. Yeah. You don't get to rest there, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. You mentioned Flannery O'Connor. I like to invoke Flannery here. Here's one of her many gems of lines. Fiction is about everything human, and we are made out of dust. And if you scorn getting yourself dusty, then you shouldn't try to write fiction. It's not a grand enough job for you. Yeah, I think you seem to. But then
Chekhov had a similar thing about cesspools or septic systems being part of the world.
Yeah, so. Face it. Yeah. Then there's another one. This is the next level. O'Connor. The writer operates at a peculiar crossroads where time and place and eternity somehow meet. His problem is to find that location.
I think that's right. I mean, it's I go back to this idea of specificity, that the kingdom to heaven is, the doorway says, be specific.
Yeah.
Because you can't enact the imaginative faculty of your reader in generalities or theories. You can only do it with a slightly frayed cuff, and so that, for me, when I realized that was a great relief, because my philosophy is rickety. I was strangely educated. I don't really have a coherent view of things, and in fact, to me now it seemed like to have an incoherent, contradictory view of things is my aspiration. But when you think about a story, it has to be on a particular day in a particular place. Particular physical conditions pertain, and somehow that's the only way you can get into making a story that's universal. And because first, the mechanics is, I have to make you stop seeing words and start experiencing images and reality. That's a real tricky bit of voodoo that isn't at all straightforward, and I don't know that anyone has ever figured it out. But some prose evokes a reality and some doesn't, and that's the small gateway you have to go through to do any of the other stuff.
Well, you're mindful of it. You're such a craftsperson, and I think famously you're known for how much time you take revising. I think of O'Connor, again, not on the script, but and I think there's something here in an aesthetics or in writing or in seeing that most people, she says, most people think Christianity is an electric blanket. What they don't know is it's the cross. And so the reason I invoke that with you is the cross. There's the obvious, religious, crucifix, the symbol, the reality of it. But it's a place of tension. And if you're not comfortable dwelling in the tensions, you're not going to see what's there.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it seems, I've heard you speak, where you're happy when what you planned blows up.
If it doesn't happen, then I know I'm in trouble. You know. So again, it's the tension of I think, especially maybe as you get older, it's very tempting to want to rest in, again, autopilot. Here's my aesthetic position. Here's the way I write a story. Here's what those stories demonstrate. But whenever I catch myself in that position of rest, I know I'm not done with that story. It has to be, and it sounds, in talking about it, you can make it sound kind of fun. But in reality, I have a story at home right now that's a 6-page thing, and part of my mind says, this is the end of the road for you because this story isn't going to be able to be finished. Part of my mind says, yeah, you felt that way before. Let's see. I think unless you have that genuine, unpleasant uncertainty, anyway, I can't make any kind of magic happen. So that's a nice job. To be enacting that cycle over and over again until you reach 180 years old or whatever. But knowing that it's not going to be the case that in a year I'm going to figure it out and phone it in. It's going to be actually aggravating until the last day I do it. And it's a cycle. It's a cycle of I don't have an idea. Oh, I have an idea, but it's probably stupid. I have an idea. Oh, maybe. Oh, yeah, actually, but I don't know how to end it. I'll probably mess it up. Oh, I ended it well. It's published, and you go right back to the first step again. Getting some level of comfort and even joy in that cycle is actually, I think, what it's about.
That's beautiful. For those of our viewers that there's a famous, the Simplica Girl Diaries was a 14-year, and you didn't give up on that story.
No, I know. No. It kept being good at the beginning. The first third kept being good. And so it's a sweet thing to say to a story, you don't seem to be ready for me. Let me step out and I'll come back in periodically. And something's going on. I would say it's a subconscious, but there's some really important work being done. And that work often manifests itself as obstruction, painful, irritating obstruction, an insolvable problem. And the one thing I've learned in the last 10 years is that be thankful for when a knot seems impossible to undo, you're really lucky. Because it will actually unknot itself if you give it time. And clenching up around it just makes it tighter. So there's kind of a real delicious, if there's anything like mastery, I think that's it. It's just to say, this is really a messed up situation. Okay.
Yeah, that's straight wisdom there. Okay, a final question about characterization. You're really good at it, you're really good at drawing characters in short spaces, brief spaces. And I think a lot of people say, well, he's like Isaac Babel, he's like Bartlemy, Vonnegut, who do O'Connor. who do these things well. That's a nice list to be thought of. Yeah. I always think too, and someone like Jonathan Franzen, I think, says this too, that I don't think he says about you, but O'Connor, maybe even Franzen does this, I don't know, but that writers often work characters like galley slaves because they want them to go somewhere, or is that just but then but you love your characters. Yes. Yeah.
I kind of long ago got out of the habit of thinking of characters as people. In other words, I think I have to develop my characters. A character is a sentence, a series of sentences that you put together to evoke a human being, or maybe more truthfully, to evoke a certain rarefied quality of human beings. A real human being is too sloppy and messy to get on the page. There's too many different valences. Yeah. So I think, but for me, one of the ways a character tells me what she wants to do is I look behind her in the story and ahead in the story and see what her function is. In story world, a story is a beautiful piece of machinery from which no part could be excluded. So therefore, a character, if you have somebody in there and your aim is to represent your friend Ted, that's not good aesthetics. This character has to do something, has to produce a meaningful change in the story. Yeah. So sometimes you can say, well, that person's function is to do X. Then the character comes in response to that. For example, in that story ComCom that you mentioned, there's a guy named Giff who's kind of a religious, kind of evangelical guy. He first appeared in the story because a friend of mine was talking like him at the first Iraq War, was saying this is a just war per St. Augustine. Yeah. So I just thought I'll have a little fun with it, typed up some text. Suddenly I've got an evangelical in my story. Yeah. Now, that's not enough of a justification. He can't stay just because he's a good picture of an evangelical. His evangelicalism has to do something. So then suddenly he's in a fight with his boss. And so I guess in order to know who somebody is, you have to know what you need them to do. Yeah. That's the galley slave idea. Yeah. It's not quite, that metaphor to me seems a little bit harsh because you're also saying, what do you want to do? Yeah. In the context of the story, what do you want to do? What do you want to say? And the galley slave will sometimes say, would you move me 2 benches back? It's going to serve your purposes better. And you say, of course, you're not a slave, you're my coworker,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's great. He's such a great character too, because you find the humanity in him, this wife-pinching guy who is filled with kind of charity. Yes. I kind of love that even amidst all of this, kind of like, oh, enough already.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that in that story particularly I learned was that if you start somebody off on the journey in the story, you make this guy. Yeah. Now, your number one, in my view, the number one goal is to keep the reader engaged. Yeah. So part of that is that every time the reader starts to accrete an idea of the story, you pull the rug out a little bit. Yeah. So they have to reconstitute. So one of the ways you do that is you make a character like Giff who looks like, at the beginning, a parody of an evangelical that some left-winger is doing to have a little bit of condescending fun. All right, the reader says, oh, that'll be fun. Let's kick that guy. At some point, then you say, actually, let's not. Yeah. Because here's something you don't know about him. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Yeah. And then the reader says, oh, yes. And in doing that, now they've just re-enlisted. Yeah. So we move ahead. Then, so in other words, you're constantly watching the reader to see if she's in a relaxed posture, or which sometimes is a condescending posture. Then you just do a little bit of posture readjustment by introducing a new element. And suddenly, the idea is to get to the end of the story, and the reader never knows what to think of the character until the very last moment. And even then, she has a multivalence idea, and that you don't close out. That line from the Philadelphia story, that the time to make up your mind about a person is never. That's true of fiction too. And it's for the writer, it's just a technique of engagement. If I say this guy was a terrible person and he stays a terrible person through the whole story, it's a moral ethical failing, but it's also a failing of escalation. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's would really characterize, I guess, to pun. But I think why you have such a broad, loving readership that really appreciate what you're doing. It's a careful construction of the real. Certainly, there's a there's a literary building in it, but it really speaks to people's hearts and minds, and really appreciate that. You know, we are talking around the Man Booker Prize winning Lincoln in the Bardo, and it's by design, viewers. We do have a nighttime event with George, so maybe a word about how you're feeling about giving that book to the world and how it's been received.
It's been amazing. You know, it's been the thing I've noticed, just sort of objectively, is that a lot of people who didn't like or don't like the stories or don't find an easy entree are finding this book a little more amenable. And I think it's because it's certainly not straightforward in its form, but I think in its heartfulness it's kind of straightforward. So that's been kind of nice. A lot of people who've had losses have come to readings and talked to me about it, which is very meaningful. Yeah. And for me, it was kind of just a midlife or latterly midlife attempt to make the room a little bigger. You know, I found out early that my talent is pretty narrow. It's not an expansive, talent. So that means you have to poke at it a little bit, and you have to challenge it so that you can get one more book out of this small pool. And in this case, it involves a little bit of sacrificing some of my go-tos, like contemporary diction, this corporate stuff we're talking about, can't be in there. Even a little bit of the humor. There's some humor in it, but it's a different flavor of humor. So to get to a point where at 52, I said, all right, let me take all the things I think I do and make them impossible. Right. Is there anything left there? It was really kind of fun. And it made me happy just because it felt like a reinvestment in the artistic project to say, maybe I don't know who I am yet, and I can deny myself the familiar gifts and still do something. You know?
It's exciting. Hey, thanks a lot for your time.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and we'll see you next time on our next conversation from Loyola, live from Loyola, the Hank Center presents, and take care.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks.